Before you can answer the question, how do you go about studying literature, you have to first think about why we bother studying literature in the first place, and what it is that we do when we study a novel or a drama. Now, I cannot possibly deal with those questions in sufficient detail without taking a very long detour that I really don't think fits in this video. So you're going to have to bear with me as I provide brief sets of answers. So firstly, we study literature because, apart from it hopefully being entertaining, it enriches our lives and helps us to expand our beings by taking us out of our normal frame of reference and showing us things we wouldn't ordinarily have seen or considered. It kind of exposes us to different perspectives and ideas and gets us thinking beyond our little bubbles of reality. And then, of course, books have a way of helping us to see familiar things in a different light and kind of see reality from a different angle. If that sounds a little bit suspicious, think about what an author does when they study. If that sounds a bit suspicious, think about what it is that an author does when they sit down and write a book. Yes, of course, they write a story, but it's far more than that. Beyond that veneer, what the author's really doing is grappling with big ideas, with the world around him, with reality itself. And as pretentious as this may sound, authors, especially good ones, tend to do this in a way that is almost more real than reality itself. Here's a way of kind of expressing this in a different way. When we say we know something, there are two ways of coming to know something. We can have somebody tell us something, we can read about it, we can hear about something propositionally. That is, somebody says something like, ice is cold. But that's not the same sort of knowledge as experiencing it firsthand and going out and touching ice. One is propositional knowledge, the other is more experiential. Now, a similar thing happens when we read books. Because when we read a book and really delve into it and really enjoy it or inhabit the world of the story, what we start to do is experience things vicariously through that story, through the characters. And what we can then, and what sort of happens then, is we start to experience the world around us in a different way, because we are not experiencing it within our own normal small bubble or framework. We're starting to see it through other characters in different situations. And we experience things that, frankly, we just haven't experienced ourselves or couldn't experience ourselves. And so what reading does is it really does open up a whole new world for us. So that's why we read. But what is it that we do when we read? Well, put simply, I think that when we read literature, what we're really trying to do is discover what the author has to say, or what the text has to say. We're looking to try and figure out what's going on the surface, of course. That is the world of the story, what actually happens in the novel or play. But there's a deeper level or a higher level, depending on how you want to put it, where we look beyond the surface elements of the story and we try and figure out what the author, what the text is really saying about the world around us. That's where we try to grapple with the big ideas and the big issues that the text is really dealing with. And because that's our task and that's what we're doing when we're reading literature, that means we are not supposed to read our own experiences, ideas, and worldviews into the text. Of course, when we sit back at the end of our interpretive journey, we can bring those things in. But when we're encountering the text for the first time, our job is to investigate. Our job is to try and figure out exactly what is going on in the world of the text and what the author says and what emerges naturally from the text. That's our job. In other words, the text is primary and it is our job to investigate it. Now, I must pause here and say that I'm well aware that not everybody agrees with this, and that's fine. That's a topic for another day as well. For people who disagree with this, you're wrong, sorry, but we're not going to investigate that today. I should also include a bit of a caveat here. I'm saying that our job when we read literature is to figure out what it has to say and to investigate it, but that doesn't mean we're not allowed to critique the ideas that we find in the book. We are well within our rights to critique it, and in fact, it's an important step in the interpretive journey. It's just that you can't critique the ideas of the book before you understand the ideas in the book to begin with. And so our first task is to understand it as well as we possibly can. Once we get what's going on in the book, in the novel or the drama, that's when we can start to critique the ideas and agree or disagree with the author, or partially agree and partially disagree, whatever the case may be. But the job starts with getting to grips with the text and understanding its different elements and what the author is trying to grapple with. So what I'm kind of saying is, we're on a mission to investigate and learn. That's what's important. We already know what we think. We're trying to figure out what other people have to say about our world and what they reveal to us about our world. Because we could well learn things, and in fact, we should be learning things when we study literature. It's supposed to broaden our horizons, not reinforce our narrow worldview. All right, and having said that, we're about ready to talk method. But I must just say quickly that the reason we start with those other questions is that kind of gives us a framework or foundation for our approach to literature, for our method. Because out of what I've been saying comes the idea that when we approach literature, we need to be expectant. We should expect to find things there, that we should be inquisitive, we should be looking to find things there and learn, and we should be humble and bring a sort of spirit of humility to it. We have things to learn from others, particularly authors. With all of that said, let's get into the method. So, step one, and this is basic, forgive me, but get very familiar with the text. Ultra basic, I know. But seriously, until you get to grips with the basics of the text, you know, what actually happens, who does what goes on, you really can't go anywhere with your study of the text. And that doesn't mean reading a summary of a novel or watching the film version. That's not enough. You have to put the effort into reading it. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing that you really need to get to know the major textual elements is because any interpretive effort has to start with you really knowing the text, because everything in your study of the book has to be based on rock-solid textual evidence. If you're making some sort of contention about what the book is saying, well, you have to be able to say, well, I know it's saying this because this, and that happens. You know, or this character says this, or here's a quote that supports it. You have to know the plot well and know it exceptionally well, because it's those little details, those little things that happen that are going to allow you to delve into the depths of the novel. Apart from the plot, you also need to know the characters inside and out. You need to know what makes them tick, their backstory, who they are, what they do, how they change and develop over time, and so on. In other words, you do need to kind of conduct a full character study. The setting is another thing you need to know well. And it's a good idea to be aware of the narrator. So it comes down to those four, really. It's plot, it's characters, it's setting, it's the narrator. There are, of course, other textual elements, and there are other things that go on in the text. For example, you could think about time anomalies, prolepsis, analepsis, ellipsis, things like that. You can definitely look into those things and any other number of textual variants, but those big four are the ones you really want to pay attention to. I guess what I'm saying is you kind of want to really live the text. You want to inhabit the world of the text as much as possible. Only when you do that can you look beyond the story and see what the text is really about. Remember, as I've indicated already here, any text operates on two levels. Any work of fiction, that is. But to get to that second level, the realm of the big ideas, you first need to pass through the first level. It's the prerequisite. Having said all of that, I must also say that people sometimes expect that they should immediately understand what a given book is all about on the first reading. And sometimes, you know, people feel bad because they're 50 pages in and they're not kind of sure what the book is about, or 100 pages in, and they still don't kind of know what the book is all about. Take the pressure off. Seriously, you don't need to understand the novel or the drama perfectly the first time you read it or see it. It usually actually takes several readings to really get to grips with what is going on in the text. Some of the books that we read, particularly the really good ones, are incredibly dense. They contain so much, and it's very often that even though we think we have a grasp after one reading or two readings, it's only after a whole number of readings that we realize that we actually kind of missed something or we misunderstood something. and we kind of figure out what the text is all about and what it's saying. And then maybe on the next reading, we find something else we didn't notice. Every reading reveals something else if you're engaged and if you approach the text with a sort of expectation that there's something of worth there and that you can find it. That openness really is the key. So I guess what I'm saying is the first step is to put yourself in a position where you have the basic knowledge that allows you to reflect on the book. That brings us to our second step. And the second step is to investigate the context of the author. Now, depending on what level you're studying and what your purpose is in studying the book or reading the book, you can take this to an extreme or you can kind of gloss over it. So you'll need to be the judge of that. Your context is going to depend on that. If you're a university student, of course, you do need to take this into account and you need to go into some detail. If you are a high school student, probably you don't need to go into as much detail. And if you're just doing it for your own pleasure or edification, well, you could skip the step entirely if you wanted to. The text is the primary thing. It's just that when you investigate the author's context and you get to know his experiences, when she lived, her context, his socioeconomic position in society, what was happening politically or historically, it kind of sometimes helps to understand what's going on in the novel. You do, of course, have to be careful not to completely read the author into the text. I know a lot of people think that any novel or any drama is sort of thinly veiled autobiography. And while it's impossible for us to not impart some of us in any work that we do, particularly creative work, we can't say that we've got to be careful not to take this too far. That's why we make a distinction between the author and the narrator, or in poetry, the speaker and the poet. We need to understand that just because something happens in a novel doesn't mean that that's just a sort of creative retelling of the author's own life. Having said that, you can definitely get extra information that's very useful, and some novels naturally require this sort of background knowledge. If I can pick on George Orwell for an example, if you read Animal Farm, while you can get the idea, your reading of the text is enriched if you understand the Soviet Union and you know some of the history that surrounds it. It's deepened further still if you know that Orwell himself was a socialist and had socialist leanings, as well as the fact that he was there in Spain during the Civil War. And it's worth knowing that he actually initially received a tremendous amount of pushback for Animal Farm because the Soviet Union was not viewed as being a pariah at the time, but actually viewed as being an ally of Britain. All of those details help to bring the text alive and provides us with extra context that helps us to understand the novel better or faster. Okay, the third aspect of our study comes down to identifying the big ideas, or what people call the themes of the text. Now, I want to deliberately separate identifying the big ideas of the text with actually studying the themes, or studying them. And I'm making the separation because there is a very clear difference between identifying them and then thoroughly investigating what the text has to say about that particular idea. You know, you can quite often identify a whole bunch of big ideas in the text as you're reading. Perhaps not all of them, but a lot of them. But you kind of need to wait until you have all the information at your disposal to look back and say, okay, I can come to a fuller study or a better understanding of what the text suggests about those big ideas or what the text reveals about those things. But before we get ahead of ourselves, how do you go about identifying the big ideas in a text? Honestly, don't overthink it. Don't stress about trying to figure it out. The big ideas, and even the minor ones, sort of naturally emerge from the events in the text when you start looking for them. They sort of naturally emerge from what's going on with the characters. The most basic thing you want to do is ask yourself, okay, what does the plot revolve around? What things do the major plot events or major conflict of the novel hinge on? For example, if you have a novel with two characters who fall in love, or one of the things that happens in the novel, like a subplot, is two characters falling in love, well then love is going to be a theme because the novel is reflecting a love story and something that happens between those two characters. If your novel is set during a war and very much in a conflict zone with soldiers being your main characters, well then war is going to be one of your major themes because that's what all the action takes place around, and the novel necessarily deals with is going to deal with war and the things of war and the reality of war, perhaps the horrors of war, perhaps trying to balance the heroism that is present in war and the horrors of war and the suffering of the soldiers and so on and so forth. But ideas surrounding war and what happens in it are going to be present, and that's going to be one of the big ideas that you investigate. The other thing you want to do is look for patterns. If there are similar images or similar things that keep on being mentioned or keep popping out in the text, like the green light in The Great Gatsby, well, that's going to be a symbol, and that symbol is going to be related to one of these big ideas. You can also ask yourself, are there a number of similar events that keep on happening, like conflicts between siblings? Well, that's probably a big idea there too, and you probably want to start there and have a look and say, okay, these two characters keep arguing. Well, what is their relationship with each other? Why did they do it? And so on. There are also just some pretty universal things, like the human condition and human nature is often a theme that you can look in there. And then other sort of universal things that we all go through and all experience are going to be ideas that can emerge as well. And I must say as well, don't worry if the ideas that you identify are pretty basic or seem pretty basic to you. Very often things that are pretty simple are actually dealt with a depth that draws out hidden depths, or that draws out hidden shades of color that you wouldn't ordinarily be aware of. And that's a good thing. So your ideas, your themes that you identify can be pretty basic, can seem pretty straightforward. Don't worry about that. Don't feel the need to go looking for something overly complicated. Keep it simple, particularly if you're inexperienced as a textual interpreter. Start with the basic stuff. The more you do this, the more that you read, and the more that you read a specific text, the more these other ideas will start to emerge, and you'll start making connections and identifying patterns, because it's largely pattern recognition. But you'll start to identify these ideas and these patterns and put things together and figure it out. It is kind of something that very often happens in the subconscious. But having said all of that, identifying themes really comes down to looking at what happens in the story and looking at the major events, the patterns that emerge there, and looking at the characters and what they do and how they relate to each other. Because that will naturally cause ideas to arise. And of course, I haven't mentioned it, but how the characters and the story relates to the setting. The historical setting can also convey something. For example, if you have a novel set in South Africa during apartheid, that would be something that you could look at as being a theme, because it's going to bring out something about reality. And I guess that's really the big thing. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that novelists do when they write something is they reflect, if they do it well, that is that they reflect reality to us, and as such, draw out things. And so the themes and the issues that we want to draw from the text do need to bear some sort of resemblance, or they do need to have some sort of connection with the world that we experience, with the world around us. And so sometimes people want to overcomplicate it, and some very intelligent people, smarter than me, will bring out things that I would never identify. But it doesn't really matter that I can't find those things. Sometimes they're just talking absolute nonsense, but that's not to say that you can't conduct a very profound study of literature dealing with a fairly straightforward topic like friendship, for example. Okay, so that's identifying your themes and big ideas. I guess actually there's one more thing to say on this. I would suggest that you write down, you keep a record of the ideas that you identify as you go along, as well as sort of some of the thoughts that you have as you encounter them. questions that you might want to ask. Why does so-and-so do this? What does this suggest about jealousy? Whatever it might be, just jot down some ideas. Keep a record of how you react to things as well, because all of this helps later on when you actually study the big ideas. And on that note, how do you go about studying them? Because that's the next step. Now I must say, it is often tempting to save time, or think that we're saving time, to try and analyze the themes as we go along reading the book for the first time. And it's fine to keep a record of our thoughts, but you really do need to read the entire novel before you can come before you have all the information at your disposal to make a proper and thorough study of it. So don't put the pressure on. Again, enjoy the process, enjoy the ride. Studying literature is a lot, as with many things in life, is a lot about enjoying the ride, and sort of allowing yourself to be taken along with it. Keep a record of what you think, but it's only when you have access to all the information at the end of your first reading, at the very earliest, that you can really start to engage in a proper study of the text. Anyway, how I want you to think about studying a work of literature is like this. You start by getting the big picture, which we've talked about. That's what's going on the surface, plot, characters, and so on. Then we narrow our focus to a particular idea that we've identified. One idea. Don't try and study multiple themes at once. One idea. So we've identified a theme. So we're narrowing our focus. And after we do that, we need to identify all the events, relevant character information, and narrative comments that are related to that particular idea. And so beneath that theme, or that big idea that you're focusing on, you're going to have a whole bunch of different blocks of information that you need to study in detail and pull apart, and try and ask questions of it to figure out what those individual blocks of evidence have to say about the topic. Because again, our job is to try and figure out what the text reveals about that topic. And so you go to a particular passage and you say, okay, the theme I'm looking at is war, because it's a war story. And this is the first battle that we encounter. Okay, what happens there? What are the characters like? How do they interact with each other? What actually happens, and what does it show us? And you start to probe the text by posing questions to it and allowing it to perhaps ask questions of you, because that happens too. And you do that for each block of evidence, for each passage from the text. And it's important to do this because you might find that different passages, reveal different aspects of the larger theme, but they might also seem to offer different ideas. Take two characters, for example. You might have, and this often pops up in films, you might have two characters who relate to the central issue in completely different ways. Possibly the oldest example is the difference between your country character and your city character. They're going to have very different ideas on the same things, on the city and the country, for a start. And so if you were just to focus on the character from the country, you would be limited to thinking that the text only says one thing about the countryside, that is. Whereas if you bring the city character in, that's going to bring out a whole bunch of different attitudes and different ideas, and you put those things together and you can come to a fuller reflection on the theme. Okay, so just pulling it back a little bit, we go from identifying our themes to identifying the evidence to investigating all the evidence, which can really just start with, what does this passage tell me about X, where X is your big idea. You have a look at what each bit of evidence suggests about the theme, and then you zoom out, you pull out a little bit, because we've zoomed in and in. Now we're going to pull back a little bit, put all of that information together, and come to a conclusion about what the text says about the particular topic you're dealing with. And at that point, you definitely want to write about what you've found. And it's a good idea to talk to somebody who has already read the book or who's reading the book with you. That just, it's very helpful, and it does help to get other people's perspectives as well. And in doing so, you're going to naturally investigate you're going to naturally think about the conclusions you've drawn. Of course, if you can't do that because you don't know anybody around you who is reading those books, writing is another good way, because writing is roughly equivalent to thinking and developing your own thought. Now, I have to stop there when it comes to investigating themes and big ideas, because beyond what I've said, the best thing to do is to actually see somebody else do it, which we don't have time to do here, and to practice doing it yourself, which is something that you're going to have to go out and do. Right, so having said that, once you've thoroughly investigated a theme or the book as a whole, you've earned the right to critique what the text has to say, what the author has to say on a particular set of issues or ideas. Now, I don't think this needs much further explanation other than reminding you to reserve judgment until you fully understand what is emerging in the text. And to say that obviously whatever objection or agreement that you have with what the author has to say or with what emerges in the text needs to be based on a logical argument. And I'm going to leave that there, because that brings us to the last aspect of our study of literature, which is something I'd like to suggest that you leave to the end of your study, although that's also kind of dependent on where you are in your literary journey. And that is bringing in secondary sources. That is scholarly articles, YouTube videos, notes from other people, basically anything that's separate from the text. You bring in at the end, once you've had a look at everything, once you've identified and studied the themes and issues, once you've reflected on them and come to a conclusion about them, once you've critiqued them, you can then bring in at the end, as the last step, you can start to bring in scholarly sources and use that to refine or even revise and rethink your conclusions about the text. Now, it might seem strange to you that I'm saying that you should leave this towards the end of the study, but think about it. You, on the one hand, you don't actually have anything to judge what a critic says about the book or a scholar has to say about a book if you don't know the book well yourself. That's the first thing. And on the other hand, the second thing is that you kind of, if you go and read a critic or a scholar first, that's going to influence how you interpret the text. It's certainly true that when you have somebody tell you that this is what a book is about, you're going to go looking for it. It might actually be that the first person is mistaken or overemphasizes something that isn't there. And you might be misled because your way of thinking, your framework, has been shaped by somebody else's opinion. But also, you might miss other important things because you get fixated on the book being about one thing. A good example is Othello. Othello is often spoken about as being the play about jealousy. And while jealousy is certainly a big aspect, a major aspect even, of the play, there are many other ideas that are of equal importance that we really should pay attention to. And so you want to avoid listening to what other people say or reading what other people say about the book until you've encountered it first. One, because you don't want it to color your interpretation of it. You don't want to be put in a position where you're going to miss things or have your interpretation unduly influenced. But two, because you really can't judge what a critic is saying about the topic until you know enough about the book to be able to say, well, actually, that's not part of the novel. Or, yeah, I can see what he's saying there. This is absolutely there. Maybe you you come to a different conclusion, but you can see that the critic at least has got something to say of substance. So you need to have something to base everything on. Now, there does need to be a little bit of an asterisk here. I also understand that in an ideal world, you have lots of time to study and you can take all the time that you want. In reality, we typically don't have that. And so we're frantically trying to churn out assignments, take tests, and so on and so forth. Or there's just the busyness of life. There's work, whatever. Socializing, family, whatever. And so our time is precious. There's also the fact that if you're new to studying literature, or you just don't have the experience, it's often quite helpful to have people provide you with a bit of a framework so that you can figure out what's going on. and so that you can get given a bit of direction. That's why teachers teach literature, after all. If we could all just magically do it ourselves, then we wouldn't need to have professors and teachers interacting with the literature with us. That sort of guided study is very useful, especially when it involves a large degree of back and forth between student and professor, or student and teacher. So there are circumstances in which it's necessary to read what experts have to say about the topic first. But having said that, once you get to the stage of being a university student, you probably want to be doing your own interpretive work first, and from there you can kind of start to have a look at what other experts, other scholars have to say about the topics. But having said that, you also want to make sure that you're open to what the scholars have to say. There's a sort of a fine line here, because you don't want to be slaves to what a scholar says simply because that person is a scholar. Having a qualification and a doctorate to your name doesn't necessarily mean you really know what you're doing. It sometimes just means you've stayed in university long enough to get the thing. Scholars can get things wrong, is what I'm saying. And they can be wrong, and they can have a faulty framework with how they approach texts. In fact, many of them do have faulty approaches. So you don't want to be slaves to what scholars say, partly because they can be wrong, partly because you want to engage in a rigorous study yourself, but you also want to be open, because there's a lot of really good stuff out there. There's a lot of really perceptive studies of works of literature that bring out hidden depths that you otherwise would never have got to. You come across people who are absolute geniuses, and they will make connections that you couldn't ever hope to make. And it's worth being open to what those people have to say, because you might have your mind changed. In fact, you should be open to having your mind changed. You should be looking to have your mind changed if the evidence is there to support them being right and you being wrong. I guess a good way of thinking about it is the earlier you are in your journey, the more you should sort of lean on your experts, the more you should be open to what they have to say. And the further on in your journey and the more proficient you get in studying, the more open you should be to disagreeing healthily with those scholars as sort of conversation partners. You can kind of have a lively discussion with the literary criticism that you read, as bizarre as that sounds. There's one other aspect to using secondary literature that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's got nothing to do with other scholars. It's got to do with other works of fiction that relate quite closely to the work that you're dealing with. Okay. So, for example, Treasure Island is a novel that is quite good to read when you read William Golding's Lord of the Flies. They both take place on the same settings. They both have very similar setups, but they reveal very different things. And in fact, Golding seems to have a far more pessimistic view of human nature, Lord of the Flies that is, than the view presented in Treasure Island. And it's quite useful to play those two things off one another. Similarly, if you were to read Shakespeare's The Tempest, it's a good idea to be aware of and to read Montaigne's essay of the Cannibals, because Shakespeare seems to be dealing with similar ideas, and many scholars argue that he seemed to be aware of Montaigne's essay as well. And part of what Shakespeare does is interact with what was going on in that essay. And so these texts play off each other, they work with each other. So what you can do, and this is not compulsory, it can just add value. It's kind of like an optional extra. It can add value to your study. And you might want to play around with having a look at other related works of literature that can help take you to places you wouldn't otherwise have gone. But again, it's not necessary. It doesn't have to be done. It really depends on the type of study that you're doing. And most of the time when we're studying a book, especially formally, we are studying that one. And unless we specifically set out to study it in relation to other works of literature, we don't have to worry about it too much. And having said all that, we come to the end of what I want to say about studying literature. I guess actually there are final two comments. Possibly the best way to think about the study of literature is to think of it as being an interpretive cycle, where you start off with the basic elements, you go through all of the steps, all of the aspects that I've drawn out, and you go back and you kind of do it again. And you do it for as many times as you read the novel. Doing that is the thing that's going to allow you to really plumb the depths. You can think of it as a bit of an interpretive cycle. The other thing I want to say is we want to enjoy the novels and the poetry and the dramas that we read. So enjoy it. And with that said, thanks for joining me on this episode. Have a great old day.